So Bertrand Russell famously describes philosophy as this no man's land. So the no in no man's land is just a term taken from warfare, which is in World War One, the war was fought in the trenches. So you'd have one enemy at one trench and another enemy at another trench, and both participants in the war would move over the trenches into this no man's land, which was neither the territory of one group or the other. And so Russell, who had lived through the First World War, was probably inspired by that. And he comes up with this metaphor that philosophy is this no man's land. And on one side of the no man's land is religion. On one side of the trench is religion. On the other side of the trench is science. And so philosophy, according to him, is this mean between those two extremes, between religion and between science. So how are we to make sense of that? And do we agree with this metaphor? Well, the way I kind of interpret it, again, is kind of like in this epistemological sense, that in some sense, religion deals with its own subject matter. It's concerned with the divine, it's concerned with value, it's concerned with meaning, it's concerned with the purpose of existence. And then science is often concerned with, how does reality work? How does it all operate? What are the principles of cause and effect, and so on and so forth. And then philosophy almost seems to be in the middle there, considering maybe aspects of both extremes. They're kind of, the philosopher is concerned with questions of meaning and value, just as the theologian is. But the philosopher is also concerned with questions of how did this all happen? What is the cause and effect at play, and so on and so forth. So Russell thinks that the philosopher is somewhere in between all of this. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that the philosopher is considered with things that haven't been quite settled yet by either religion or science. Therefore, it's this no man's land. It's this land in which kind of things are up for grabs. And it's this hypothetical place of possibilities, perhaps. Maybe the philosopher is he who comes up with our concepts of the world. And then it's up to the scientists to test those concepts. The philosopher maybe also might come up with ideals of, what is the virtuous life. So he's considering possibilities that, are traditionally handled by, the theologian, insofar as the theologian is concerned with coming up with answers to the question of what's the meaning of it all, what's the value of it all, and so on and so forth. So the philosopher occupies this middle point, this mean between the extremes in that sense. So I guess the question is, do we agree with that metaphor? And I guess we can kind of maybe think about this in terms of stages of, how our knowledge develops. And, maybe it's the case that religion comes first in the development of thinking. The theologian is someone who, like the priest or the shaman or somebody, there's someone who experiences a divine revelation. For example, that there's a unity among all organisms. There's kind of an energy or a force that underlies everything. And, based on that understanding, they come to the realization, okay, well, maybe everything is one. Maybe there's this, maybe there's an energy, call it God or something, that underlies everything. And then perhaps after that, the philosopher comes along and steps onto the scene and says, well, maybe we can explain the same thing metaphysically and rationally. So maybe the existence of God, that's presented itself through divine revelation, can also be explained in terms of principles of logic and reason. So, nothing can come from nothing, right? There has to be a cause of what is. There has to be a cause of the universe. So Aristotle thought of this as the prime mover, the uncaused cause. And from that everything else develops. So now we're making sense of the divine revelation of that God exists, but we're making sense of it rationally and philosophically. And then maybe the scientist wants to step onto the scene and say, hey, quantum physics tells us that everything, matter and energy are just kind of the same thing. And it's just a different, when matter ceases to be, it just is converted to energy and vice versa. And
it's a matter of energy, man.
yeah, it's matter and energy, right? So we have this developmental perspective that we could take in thinking about this. And so maybe the philosopher is somebody who stands in the middle, who wants to just think about this rationally and conceptually. The theologian is somebody who wants to just think about this in terms of revelation, not necessarily reason, but revelation, which is kind of a flash of insight that doesn't come through reason, but which just comes from being receptive to the divine. It's something that happens to you, I suppose. And then the scientist comes along and says, okay, how is all of this working? What equations can we use to explain this? What kind of cosmological argument can we come up for all of this? So I don't know if I've done justice to what Russell was actually trying to explain here, but this is kind of how I've made sense of it. I don't know if you're on board with any of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think all three, religion, philosophy, science, are all trying to provide explanations of the world. And I think there are various different stages and attempts at doing that. And I'm thinking it in terms of different gradations of certainty and faith. You start at religion. I think I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, that some explanation, even if it relies on faith, is better than none. That way you have some sort of organization and consistency and predictability in your environment. And I think that's where religion really comes into place. A lot of it is faith. And I think, that's fine. And then philosophy, especially if you look at the works of Kant, he's trying to really make science, and in particular metaphysics, a complete and certain science, the queen of all sciences. That's the goal, to provide certainty for this sort of thing. And I think it does occupy somewhat of a middle ground, a no man's land, so to speak, where there's a degree of certainty, but there still are fundamental principles that you have to take for granted in a certain sense, take on faith. And I think that's that's just sort of the case. And I think science is maybe half step above that, from philosophy, where again, there are still certain principles that we just have to take for granted, that we have to just sort of assume, less so than I'd say most philosophies, but I think science to a large extent relies on a certain philosophical conception of the world. In particular, Newton's physics, relies on a materialistic, causal sort of conception, a physicalist conception of the world. And that entails having to just accept as brute fact certain things. But I think from that you can derive observations. You can conduct, experiments that get to these observations, that provide a level of certainty that just hasn't been seen before. And I think, again, they kind of sit on a continuum. We keep going back to this idea of a continuum, from uncertainty and faith, referencing religion, to certainty, where we get to science. I don't think we've arrived at complete and certain, anything complete and certain, but science is the best we have, and it might be the best we ever get. I'm not sure I'm not sure there's anything we could be certain about, to the foundation. I'm not sure that that's possible. but insofar it is possible, so far it's possible to get close to that ideal of certainty, I think science does the best job.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, the history of science is one of, continually shifting paradigms through continual revisions of knowledge, through abandoning what we thought was certain and replacing with newly discovered truths, which then become more certain for us. Um, I like the metaphor of the continuum personally. You know, I don't necessarily see theology and metaphysics and science as being in fundamental opposition to one another. In fact, I kind of maybe they form this kind of holy trinity or something. And I think that in some sense I think all human beings have a revelatory experience, maybe an experience that seems to be ineffable in some sense. It's hard to put it in words. And it's an experience that doesn't seem to be coming from us, but something that's happening to us. Maybe it's the perception of the unity of all living beings or something. And as philosophers, we're tasked with the, the challenge of making sense of that, maybe on a conceptual level. And maybe it is kind of as Plato pointed out, maybe there is this transcendental world of forms and of spirits and of entities and so on and so forth. And the philosopher is he who has an open enough mind to be receptive to these things, and then to articulate them and make sense of them rationally. For example, goodness or love or things like that. Maybe these are qualities and feelings that are maybe divine in origin. Maybe they come from the top down, as it were, and we're more or less conduits for these perceptual experiences. And philosophers have talked about this a lot. But then the scientist comes along and maybe through the tools of the trade is able to, explain and predict the relationships which account for those experiences. In quantum physics, there's the double slit experiment, right? So it's the actual activity of perceiving the neuron determines whether it's a particle or a wave, right? So how does that tie back to everything? Well, I guess the way that we perceive that fundamental reality, whether that's a spiritual reality or whatever, it's partly dependent upon the mechanisms of perception. So to the extent that we can perceive the divine, that's affected by, how the act of perception itself, and what the conditions are and so on and so forth. So I don't know if this is making any sense, but I'm trying to tie all these different threads together. What I'm just trying to get to, I guess, at bottom is that the scientist is trying to explain how it is that we have these revelatory experiences, these mystical experiences, how, and then the philosophers may be trying to explain why we have them from a more conceptual standpoint. And then the theologian is more or less just kind of concerned with the experience as such. And, that's what the scriptures are about, and that's what the Vedic texts are about, and so on and so forth. But again, these are fuzzy boundaries, and it's hard for me, I guess, in part to draw a rigid distinction between theology and philosophy and religion in some sense.
Yeah. Especially the philosophy and all of them, kind of depends on what perspective you're taking. I see a lot of overlap with religion and philosophy, especially on when you're trying to provide meaning to life. The existentialists are really trying to fill that void, after the fall of religion. It's trying to fill that existential void. Um, you know, you look at Nietzsche, talking about the death of God, and what are we supposed to do after that? Once all those sort of values are gone. So there's that, and then there's the philosophy which really tries to question, some of the assumptions of science, particular materialism. So yeah, I think it kind of takes a critical perspective towards both, and in that sense, it really does occupy sort of this middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think we've maybe expressed the same thing in different ways, or at least agreed to at least some ways in which philosophy occupies the middle ground. So maybe it is a good metaphor in some sense. Maybe the metaphor needs some updating because we're not going through times of trench warfare these days, but warfares of different varieties. And I don't know, maybe the new no man's land is the internet or something, where everything is kind of in a state of anarchy,